Hey, welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been following this channel, you know we focus on real human experiences that are hard to explain, but still show up clearly in everyday life, often in ways that feel personal, consistent, and impossible to ignore once you notice them. Today, we're looking at something many people quietly live with for years, sometimes without ever finding a clear answer, even after trying to understand it from every logical angle they can think of, and even after talking about it with others who cannot fully explain it either. A fear that has no clear beginning, no event you can point to, and no moment in your life where it obviously started, yet it feels real every time it shows up. Imagine this. You're standing near water, maybe at a pool, a lake, or the ocean, and everything around you is calm, normal, and safe, with no sign of danger and no reason to feel uncomfortable in that moment. But your body reacts. Your chest tightens. Your breathing changes. And something inside you tells you to step back immediately, even though your mind knows there is no real threat in front of you. It feels like panic, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but a strong reaction that happens on its own, without your permission. And the strange part is this. Nothing has ever happened to you in water. No accident, no bad memory, no past experience that explains why this reaction exists. So the question is simple. If nothing happened, why does it feel like something did? At first, the fear does not look serious from the outside because it only shows up in specific situations. And most of the time, the person can avoid those situations without drawing attention to it, which makes it easy for others to miss what is actually happening. They might avoid going near water, even in normal settings like pools or beaches, and they may come up with simple reasons to explain it, like saying they are not interested, or they prefer to stay dry, or they just do not enjoy those environments, even though the real reason feels much deeper and harder to explain. The same pattern can appear in other forms, where someone avoids heights, refuses to enter small enclosed spaces, or feels uncomfortable in situations that most people handle without thinking twice. And over time, these choices begin to shape how they live their daily life. What makes this more difficult is not just the behavior, but the physical reaction that comes with it, because the body does not respond calmly or gradually, but instead reacts immediately and strongly, as if it is responding to something urgent and real. The heart rate increases without warning. The chest feels tight, breathing becomes shallow, and the person may feel the need to step away as quickly as possible, even when they know logically that there is no danger in front of them, which creates a clear gap between what they understand and what they feel. This creates a quiet form of anxiety that is hard to explain to others, because from the outside, the situation looks normal, but from the inside, the reaction feels intense and difficult to control, which often leads to frustration and confusion over time. Some people begin to question themselves, wondering if they are overreacting or if something is wrong with them, because they cannot find a clear reason for why their body responds this way, especially when they compare themselves to others who do not have the same reaction. In many cases, they try to understand it using logic, by looking back at their past, thinking carefully about their childhood, and asking themselves if they missed something important. But nothing stands out as a clear cause, and no specific memory explains the intensity of the fear. Others may try to work through it by talking to someone, exploring their thoughts, or trying to gradually face the situation in small steps, hoping that repeated exposure will reduce the reaction. And sometimes this helps slightly, but it often does not remove the fear completely. The most confusing part is that the fear does not behave like a new or unfamiliar reaction, because it does not feel like something they are learning in the moment, but instead feels automatic, fast, and already established, as if it has been there long before they became aware of it. It does not feel like hesitation or uncertainty, where the mind is trying to decide what to do, but instead feels like a direct response, where the body moves first, and the mind tries to catch up afterward, which creates a sense that the reaction is coming from somewhere deeper. Over time, this leads to a simple but difficult realization, because the person begins to see that the fear is real, consistent, and not random, yet it does not connect to anything they can clearly identify in their current life. And that is where the problem becomes harder to ignore. The fear exists, the reaction is real, but the origin remains unclear. At this point, the situation becomes harder to explain, because everything about the reaction suggests that it comes from experience. Yet there is no clear experience to point to, which creates a gap that logic alone cannot close. In most cases, fear follows a simple pattern, where something happens first, and then the body learns to react to it. So the memory and the reaction are connected in a way that makes sense, even if the reaction feels strong or uncomfortable. If someone had a bad experience in water, then fear of water would feel reasonable, and even if the memory fades over time, the emotional response can still remain, which is something people can understand and accept without much difficulty. But here, that connection is missing, because there is no event, no accident, and no moment in the person's life that explains why the reaction exists in the first place, which breaks the normal pattern that people rely on to understand fear. And yet, the reaction still behaves as if that pattern exists, because the body does not hesitate, does not question, and does not slowly build up the response, but instead reacts immediately, as if it already knows what to do in that situation. This is where the contradiction becomes clear. How can something feel like a memory when nothing actually happened? The reaction is not weak or uncertain, but strong and consistent, and it appears in the same way each time, which makes it feel less like a guess and more like a stored response that is already in place. The body reacts first, and the mind follows after, trying to make sense of what just happened, which creates a feeling that the response is coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. It does not feel like imagination, because imagination usually requires effort, and it does not feel like learning in the moment, because learning takes time and repetition. But this reaction appears instantly, without either of those processes. In simple terms, it feels like the body remembers something that the mind does not. This creates a tension that is difficult to resolve, because both sides of the experience feel real at the same time, where the logical side says there is no reason for the fear, while the physical reaction says there is a reason, even if it cannot be explained clearly. The person is left between these two positions, trying to trust their understanding while also dealing with a reaction that does not follow that understanding, which can lead to a sense of being disconnected from their own response. Over time, this tension builds into a deeper question, because the issue is no longer just about fear itself, but about the source of that fear, and whether it always has to come from something that happened in this life. And once that question appears, the usual explanations begin to feel incomplete, because they can describe how fear works, but not always where it begins, especially in cases where no clear starting point exists. So the problem becomes more precise. If fear normally comes from experience, and there is no experience here, then where is this reaction coming from? And why does it feel so familiar, even without a memory to support it? At this point, the usual explanations begin to reach their limit, because they can describe how fear behaves, but they do not fully explain why it exists without a clear starting point, which is where a different perspective begins to enter the conversation. This is where the work of Edgar Cayce is often introduced, not as something to believe without question, but as a way to look at the same experience from a different angle, one that focuses less on events in the current life, and more on patterns that may carry over time. In many of his readings, Cayce described fear in a very specific way, not as a random reaction, and not as something imagined, but as something that can come from what he called retained experience, meaning an impression that remains even when the original event is no longer part of conscious memory. The important part of this idea is that the fear is not symbolic, and it is not abstract, but instead feels direct and physical, as if the body is responding to something it has already gone through, even if the person cannot recall that experience in any clear way. According to this view, certain fears are not created in the moment, and they are not learned slowly over time, but instead appear fully formed because they are tied to experiences that were intense enough to leave a lasting imprint. These are often described as moments where the body was under extreme stress, where the situation was immediate, overwhelming, and difficult to process, which means the response becomes deeply embedded rather than gradually learned. For example, in cases involving fear of water, Cayce often connected this reaction to experiences of drowning, where the body struggled to breathe, lost control, and entered a state of panic that became fixed as a pattern. In cases involving fear of heights, the explanation often pointed to falling, where the sudden loss of balance and the feeling of losing control created a strong response that remained even after the event itself was no longer remembered. In situations involving fear of enclosed spaces, the interpretation often involved confinement, where the person experienced restriction, lack of movement, or difficulty breathing, which again created a response that stayed in place over time. The key idea here is simple but important. The fear is treated as an imprint of experience, not as a reaction built from imagination, and not as something that needs to be constructed step by step, but as something that already exists and becomes visible under certain conditions. This helps explain why the reaction feels immediate, because it is not being created in that moment, but instead triggered, which means the situation acts as a signal that activates a response that is already present. It also explains why the reaction feels consistent, because if the source is an imprint rather than a new learning process, then the pattern will repeat in a similar way each time it is triggered, without needing to be relearned. Another important detail in this perspective is that the person does not need to remember the original event for the response to remain active, because the imprint is not stored as a clear story, but as a physical and emotional pattern that the body recognizes. This creates a situation where the body responds first, and the mind tries to explain it later, which matches the experience described earlier, where the reaction appears before the person has time to think through it. At the same time, this perspective does not claim that every fear comes from this type of origin, and it does not reject psychological explanations, but instead focuses on cases where the usual explanations do not fully account for the intensity or consistency of the reaction. So rather than replacing one explanation with another, it adds a new layer to consider, especially in situations where the fear feels too immediate, too specific, and too consistent to be explained only by current life experience. When viewed this way, the fear is no longer seen as something random or unexplainable, but as something that may have a source, even if that source is not directly accessible through memory or logic. And this leads to a different way of understanding the reaction, because instead of asking what caused the fear in this life, the question becomes whether the reaction is connected to something that was experienced more deeply and then carried forward as a pattern. This does not require belief to consider, and it does not force a conclusion, but it offers a way to make sense of why the body might respond with such certainty, even when the mind has no clear reason to support it. And once this idea is introduced, the fear begins to look less like a random problem and more like a consistent pattern that might be showing up for a reason, even if that reason is not immediately clear. Once this perspective is introduced, the next step is to look beyond a single case, because one example can always be questioned, but patterns across many people are harder to ignore, especially when those patterns appear in similar ways without direct connection between individuals. There are many reports of people who describe the same type of fear, showing up early in life, often before they have had enough experience to develop it through normal learning. And in many of these cases, the details are surprisingly consistent even when the individuals have very different backgrounds. For example, someone with a fear of water may describe not just discomfort, but a very specific reaction, such as the feeling of being pulled under, difficulty breathing, or a sudden sense of losing control, even when they are standing safely at the edge of shallow water. Another person, in a completely different place and context, may describe almost the same internal experience, using similar words, and reacting in a similar way, despite having no shared event or connection that would explain why their responses match so closely. The same pattern appears with fear of heights, where individuals often report a sudden and intense sense of falling. Not just fear of being high up, but a physical sensation that feels immediate, as if the fall is already happening, even while they are standing still. In cases involving enclosed spaces, the descriptions often include difficulty breathing, pressure, and an urgent need to escape, which again feels less like a general discomfort and more like a specific response that activates quickly and consistently. What stands out is not just the presence of fear, but the similarity in how that fear is experienced, because the reactions are not random or vague, but structured in a way that suggests a repeating pattern rather than isolated individual differences. When multiple people describe similar reactions without a shared cause in their current lives, it raises a simple but important question, because it suggests that something deeper may be shaping these responses, even if that source is not directly visible. At the same time, modern psychology also studies these types of fears, often referring to them as phobias, and it provides clear models for how fear can develop, be reinforced, and become automatic over time through repeated exposure or learned associations. From a psychological perspective, fear can form when the brain connects a situation with a negative outcome, even if that outcome happened only once, and over time, the response can become faster and stronger as the pattern is reinforced. There is also the idea that some fears may be inherited in a general way, where certain sensitivities are passed down through biological or environmental factors, making a person more likely to react strongly in specific situations. These explanations are useful because they describe how fear operates, how it becomes automatic, and how it can continue even when the original cause is no longer present, which helps explain many everyday cases. However, there are situations where these explanations feel incomplete, especially when the person cannot identify any moment where the fear could have been learned, and when the reaction appears too specific and immediate to have developed gradually. This is where the comparison becomes important, because it is not about choosing one explanation over another, but about noticing where each explanation works well and where it leaves questions unanswered. Psychology explains the mechanism, showing how fear is stored, triggered, and repeated within the brain and body, which helps us understand the process. Cayce's perspective, on the other hand, focuses on the possible origin of that stored response, suggesting that in some cases, the source may not be limited to the current lifetime. When both views are placed side by side, a clearer picture begins to form, because they are not necessarily in conflict, but instead describe different parts of the same experience, where one explains how the reaction works, and the other explores where it might come from. This combined view allows us to see fear not just as a surface reaction, but as something that may have layers, where the visible behavior is only the final expression of a deeper pattern that has been carried and triggered over time. And when the same types of fears continue to appear across different people, with similar intensity and structure, it becomes harder to dismiss them as random or purely individual, because the consistency suggests that there may be a shared pattern underneath. This does not prove a single explanation, and it does not remove the value of psychological understanding, but it does open the possibility that some fears may have roots that are not immediately visible within a person's current life experience. So instead of seeing these cases as exceptions or anomalies, they begin to look like part of a larger pattern, one that repeats across different individuals, different environments, and different situations, yet produces similar reactions in each case. And once that pattern is recognized, the question shifts again, because it is no longer just about explaining one person's fear, but about understanding why the same type of fear continues to appear in similar ways across many different lives. Once we begin to see that these fears may follow patterns, the question slowly changes, because instead of asking only how to remove the fear, we begin to ask what the fear might represent, and whether it is pointing to something that has not been fully understood yet. In everyday thinking, fear is usually treated as a problem to fix, something unwanted that should be reduced, controlled, or eliminated as quickly as possible, especially when it interferes with normal life or creates discomfort that feels unnecessary. This approach makes sense in many situations because fear can limit choices, create stress, and affect how a person moves through the world, which is why most solutions focus on managing the reaction and helping the person feel more in control. But when a fear has no clear origin, and when it behaves like a stored response rather than a learned reaction, trying to remove it without understanding it can sometimes feel incomplete, because the surface response may change, but the deeper pattern may still remain. This is where a different approach begins to take shape. One that does not immediately try to erase the fear, but instead tries to understand what the fear is doing, why it appears in specific situations, and what kind of response it is trying to trigger. When viewed this way, fear is no longer just an obstacle but becomes a signal, something that points to a deeper layer of experience that has not been fully processed or recognized, even if it is not accessible as a clear memory. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this feeling?" the question becomes, "What is this reaction connected to?" And "Why does it show up in this exact form, in this exact situation, every time?" This shift may seem small, but it changes the direction of attention, because the focus moves from resistance to observation, and from control to understanding, which often creates more space to see the pattern clearly. For example, a fear of water may not only be about avoiding water, but about understanding why the reaction is so immediate, why breathing becomes difficult, and why the body reacts as if it is already in danger, even before anything actually happens. In the same way, a fear of heights may not just be about staying away from high places, but about noticing the exact moment the sensation appears, how quickly it builds, and how consistent the response is across different situations. When attention shifts in this way, the fear begins to reveal structure, because it is no longer seen as random, but as something that follows a pattern, appears under specific conditions, and produces a predictable reaction each time. This does not mean the fear disappears immediately, and it does not mean the reaction becomes easy to manage right away. But it does create a different relationship with the experience, one that is less based on avoidance and more based on awareness. In many cases, this awareness alone begins to change how the fear is experienced, because when something is observed clearly, it often becomes less overwhelming, even if it is still present, and the person may begin to feel less controlled by the reaction. From this perspective, fear is no longer just something that happens to a person, but something that can be studied, understood, and gradually integrated into a larger understanding of how their responses work. This also opens the possibility that the fear is not meaningless, because if it follows a pattern, appears consistently, and carries a specific type of reaction, then it may be pointing to something that has not been fully resolved yet. Whether that source is explained through psychology or through deeper interpretations like those suggested earlier, the key shift remains the same, because the focus moves from eliminating the fear to understanding it. And once that shift happens, the experience begins to change, not because the fear is gone, but because the person is no longer facing it as something completely unknown or without context. Instead, it becomes something that can be explored, something that can be observed, and something that may carry information about deeper patterns that are still active beneath the surface. And in that sense, fear is no longer just a reaction to avoid, but a signal worth paying attention to, especially when it appears without a clear reason and continues to repeat in the same way over time. To understand this more clearly, it helps to look at how modern psychology explains fear. Because even without using any deeper interpretation, psychology already accepts that the human mind and body can store reactions that continue long after the original trigger is gone, which gives us a useful starting point. In psychology, fear is often connected to the idea of subconscious memory, where the brain records an experience along with the emotional and physical response that came with it. And even if the person does not clearly remember the event, the body can still react when something similar appears. This is why someone can feel anxious in a situation that seems harmless, because the brain is not only responding to what is happening now, but also to patterns it has already stored, which may not always be accessible through conscious thought. There is also the concept of emotional conditioning, where a strong reaction becomes linked to a specific situation, and over time, that link becomes automatic, so the response happens quickly without needing to be relearned each time. In some cases, this conditioning can happen after a single intense experience, especially if the situation involved strong fear or stress, because the brain prioritizes survival and tends to store those moments more deeply than ordinary events. Another idea often discussed is that certain sensitivities may be inherited in a general way, meaning a person may be more likely to react strongly to certain triggers due to biological factors, even if they have not personally experienced a specific event related to that fear. All of these explanations help us understand how fear works, because they show that reactions can be stored, repeated, and triggered automatically, which matches the experience described earlier, where the body responds before the mind has time to analyze the situation. However, there is still a difference that stands out, because in most psychological models, there is usually an assumption that the original source of the fear exists somewhere within the person's current life, even if it is hidden or forgotten. This is where the earlier perspective adds something different, because it suggests that in some cases, the stored response may not begin within the current life at all, but may instead be carried as a deeper pattern that continues to activate under certain conditions. When both views are considered together, they begin to align in an interesting way, because psychology explains the mechanism of storage and response, while the other perspective explores a different possibility for the origin of what is being stored. This does not require choosing one over the other, and it does not mean that one explanation replaces the other, but instead allows both to exist side by side, each describing a different part of the same experience. From this combined view, fear can be understood as a stored reaction that is triggered in the present, while the question of where that reaction originally formed remains open, especially in cases where no clear event can be identified. This approach keeps the discussion grounded, because it does not move away from what we can observe, which is the consistent pattern of reaction, while still allowing space to consider why that pattern might exist in the first place. And in that sense, the focus remains the same, because whether the origin is explained through current life experience or through a deeper interpretation, the key point is that the reaction is real, the pattern is consistent, and the response follows a structure that can be observed and understood over time. At this point, we can step back and look at the full picture, because what started as a simple question about fear has now expanded into something more structured, where the reaction, the pattern, and the possible explanations all begin to connect in a clearer way. The first thing that becomes clear is that not all fear follows the same path, because while many fears can be traced back to events in this life, There are also cases where no clear origin can be found, yet the reaction remains strong, consistent, and immediate. In those cases, the fear does not behave like something new, and it does not feel like something being learned over time, but instead appears as if it is already in place, waiting to be triggered under the right conditions, which suggests that the response may come from a deeper level of stored experience. This does not prove where the fear comes from, and it does not require a fixed explanation, but it does open the possibility that some reactions may carry patterns that extend beyond what we can easily remember or identify in our current life. The second point is that regardless of origin, the pattern itself is real, and it can be observed, studied, and understood, which means the focus does not have to stay on uncertainty, but can shift toward awareness and recognition of how the reaction works. And finally, this leads to a simple but important idea. Because if a fear can exist without a clear beginning and still follow a consistent pattern, then understanding that pattern may be more useful than trying to force a single explanation for its origin. In that sense, awareness becomes the first step, not because it removes the fear immediately, but because it changes the way the person relates to it, making the experience less confusing and more understandable over time. So when we come back to the original question, it no longer feels as simple as it did at the beginning, because what first looked like an unexplained reaction now appears as something that follows a pattern, carries a consistent response, and may have a source that is not immediately visible. If fear does not always begin in this life, then it may not be random, and it may not be something that appears without reason, even when that reason is not clear at first, which changes how we look at the experience. Instead of seeing fear only as something to avoid or remove, it becomes something to observe, something to question, and something that may point to a deeper pattern that is still active beneath the surface, waiting to be understood rather than pushed away. So the question shifts again, but this time it becomes more personal. If fear doesn't begin in this life, what is it trying to remind you of? And when you think about your own experiences, are there reactions, emotions, or patterns that feel stronger than they should, or appear more quickly than you expect, even when you cannot explain where they come from? If this made you think about something in your own life, let me know in the comments, because these patterns often become clearer when we start putting them into words and looking at them more closely. If you found this perspective useful, don't forget to like and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives. And if there's something in this video that you still question or want to explore further, leave your thoughts below, because your questions often shape what we explore next.